we benefit, all of us, from a robust debate, and what the whole point of this country.
Well, that's one of the things that we don't necessarily that aren't necessarily agreed upon anymore. But that was one of the things we take for granted.
Yeah, but this is our show, so
Hello, welcome to the Call Like I See It podcast. I'm James Keys, and in this episode of Call Like I See It, we're going to discuss the dysfunction in the U.S. House of Representatives following the ouster of Kevin McCarthy as Speaker of the House, and consider what is driving this level of dysfunction that has essentially paralyzed the House of Representatives right now. And later on, we're going to react to some economic data, some recent economic data, which shows that Latinos in the U.S. now have an economic output that exceeds the nation of India, which has 1.4 billion people in it. So that's a lot of economic output, for the just the Latinos in the U.S. Joining me today is a man who went deep into his bag of fire takes last week. Tunde Ogunlana. Tunde, one question for you, man. Are you ready to give me some more?
Yes, sir. But don't tell everyone it's a very small bag. It's like a
That's how you had to go so deep.
Yeah. It wasn't like Santa's bag of gifts, big and nice and big. But
there you go.
Just a little. Yeah.
No, we're recording this on October 17th, 2023. And a couple weeks ago, Kevin McCarthy was voted out of his speakership position, and in an effort that was led by just 8 Republican congressmen out of 435 total congressmen. And it was historic in that it was the first time a Speaker of the House was voted out, during the term like that. Now, the House needs a Speaker. That's an important leadership role in terms of organizing the business, bringing votes to the floor, and so forth. So the Republicans, who are in the majority of the House, have now immediately began an effort to replace him as the Speaker of the House. They first nominated Steve Scalise, but he stepped down almost immediately within a day because he just didn't have the votes to win the speakership, so to speak. He canvassed the room and saw he didn't have the votes and stepped down. And so now we have Jim Jordan, who's nominated, and we're expecting a vote here by the time this comes out. And he's been putting on the full court press, and there's been reports on that as far as to try to get the votes to win the speakership. The key is that out of the 220 or so Republican congressmen, which is a majority of the 435, you need pretty much everybody. You can only have about 4 defects or people who don't vote for you of your caucus in order to have enough to have the majority of the votes, because none of the Democrats or none of the members of the Democratic Party are going to vote for the Republican nominee. So all the while, there's no elected speaker. So the House of Representatives just isn't operating, at all. Meaning this isn't just dysfunction, but it's not even operational. So Tunde, what are your thoughts on the deposing of Kevin McCarthy by the GOP Congress, and a couple weeks back, and also just the struggle to agree on a new Speaker of the House?
Good question, but before I answer, I just want to piggyback on what you just said, because you just said a mouthful. In terms of, I realize as I'm listening to you, I'm like, man, that's a lot.
That's a lot. Yeah, last 2 weeks.
But it also made me realize that if what you talked about just now requires necessarily a certain understanding of our government and the functioning of it, like what is the House of Representatives? Why is it there? Why do we have members of the House? What do they represent? Who are they? And all that stuff. So I know we'll cover some of that, but it just, what it got me back to realizing is, this is the great system we have is about the people's participation in it. Yeah. So we do have the democracy we deserve in that sense. So I know we'll get into that, but to answer you directly, I find this all fascinating. The note I wrote in preparation was a slow moving train wreck, and I'm on a train. That's because just like a slow moving train wreck, it's like I'm kind of watching it, knowing that it's not comfortable. And this is going to be probably painful for somebody. But like I said, I'm on this train because I'm American and I live in this country. So we're all dealing with this together in a sense, no matter how we feel about it. You know what I mean? Yeah. So it's
there's no celebration here going on that our Congress, our legislative branch, can't get their stuff together.
Yeah, exactly. So, well, let's put it this way: we aren't celebrating. Maybe
Yeah.
someone out there is. So then it kind of just brought me back, and knowing we're talking about this, right? This topic, I thought about the fact that Speaker McCarthy, it took him 15 votes, a record, to get his speakership.
Yeah.
Because he kept having to concede his own, I guess, political future, which played out this way, to a small faction of very
Of holdouts,
hardline people in his party.
Yeah.
And so this is an example of minority rule within a democratic republic of the United States, meaning it seems like 96% of Republicans in Congress did not want him removed.
Yeah.
So 4% of the Congress, or the Republican Congress,
the Republican part,
were able to do this. And again, I don't know if that's dysfunction or how the system's supposed to work, but I guess that's the conversation we're gonna have.
But I mean, you made the point though that it's his, as a part of becoming speaker, of getting the votes, securing the votes that he needed to become the speaker in the first place, he set the stage for his demise. Because the concessions that he made are the things that allowed it, or made it easy for a small group of Republican congressmen to later on, if they decide to take him out. And they wanted that to have constant leverage on him. And ultimately it wasn't a bluff. Like they weren't just saying, oh yeah, we want to be able to threaten you. They ultimately took him out. Now, to me, what I see what's happening here is kind of a reorganization of the hierarchy of the Republican coalition. As you noted, these are kind of far right agitators, or whatever you want to call them, within the Republican political parties. I've talked about this before. In the United States, we form coalitions before the voting. Our coalitions are housed under parties. In parliamentary systems around the world, you'll have a bunch of different parties, and they'll all win a percentage of the vote, and then they'll come to parliament and make governing coalitions. Well, our coalitions are done beforehand because of the nature of our elections. You had to get to 51%, or you want to be able to get to 51%, so you don't want to be fragmented with a bunch of different groups. And so the coalitions form, and so within each of the parties, the varying coalitions have different amount of power, different levels of power. And so you kind of have the traditional group that's been in power of the Republican coalition for a while, and they're just basically taking fire from the right flank, and the right flank is trying to say, we are going to be the dominant coalition now in this party. And this is something that many people have said has happened, across the board, the big lie type of stuff, like that there's this coming from the extreme right that are saying, look, the Republican Party is going to be about us now. It's not going to be about, small government, or, all these things that we think about from 1980 that the Republican Party said they were about, but it's going to be about different stuff now, whether that's Donald Trump, or whether that's, the never compromise on anything or anything like that. So to me, that's what I really see here, is that this is this coalition right here was like, look, McCarthy is not sufficiently doing our bidding. We set up the trap door on him when he got in here. We're going to pull the trap door, and then they're going to try to impose upon the next person who comes either similar types of constraints, or they're going to try to get one of their own to be the Speaker of the House then.
Yeah. No, and I think, as you're finishing, it makes me realize the fact that the just former Speaker, Mr. McCarthy, is out. He broke 2 records. So he broke the record when he got nominated for the most votes, because he had to twist himself into a pretzel. And then he broke the record for being the first guy ever removed in this way.
Which are related.
Yeah, exactly. And it's pretty embarrassing. And so I think, not to knock him, it's more of, this is, I think, the symptom of a wider problem that's been brewing for some time, especially over the last decade, but it had seeds even earlier than that. And I think we're at the culmination. This is just very interesting, being alive to watch this in our own country, because this is no longer about the traditional disagreements between liberals and conservatives over how to deal with government and what its role should be in our lives. So like you said, about
should taxes be relatively high or relatively low? But
correct.
Again, still in some kind of range.
How should that tax revenue be used, right?
Like
for entitlement programs and helping out people, your single moms trying to raise their kids and helping them with food stamps and early learning projects, or should it go to defense spending and giving, oil and gas companies leases on federal lands, that are very cheap? those are the things you and I grew up with in terms of the arguments between both parties. But they both centered around an idea of, it was really about the philosophy of the two different bases of each party of how to see the country move forward.
Well, let me say that a different way.
Yeah.
It wasn't those arguments weren't about the what. The what was agreed upon. What are we doing here? It was the how. How are we going to use our resources to accomplish the what? But I think what you're getting to now is that we're actually having more. We're heading more towards some disagreements about the what. Like, okay, well, what are we going to be working on here?
What's interesting is, and this is just interesting, it's really sad for me to say it, because I think we benefit, all of us, from a robust debate, and what the whole point of this country.
Well, that's one of the things that we don't necessarily that aren't necessarily agreed upon anymore. But that was one of the things we take for granted.
Yeah, but this is our show, so I'm expressing my opinion.
So I'll let you say it without being challenged.
Yeah, exactly. Come on. So of course, some people don't agree with this. That's why we're here. That's the whole conversation. So no, but that's the point, is saying that the idea of debate, you have the Congress, again, like I said at the beginning, you said some complex things, which aren't, I'm not saying it to be a smart ass. What I'm saying is it's the understanding of the system. We have an upper and lower chamber of the U.S. Congress. The Senate is the upper chamber, the House of Representatives being the lower chamber. Both create and ratify legislation that goes to the president's desk for signature. So the idea is that debate between the two parties, as de facto and proxy representatives of us, the voters, happens in those chambers. Like you said, that should lead to an outcome that benefits the nation, puts us forward with the best ideas. And what I think we're seeing is the culmination of this era of anger and kind of grievance. And this is what it's turned into, and this is why I think it's hard for the Republican Party to find this direction right now, because what they've done is exhausted.
Let me ask you the question. I want to ask you this. Why do you think it's so hard for them to come up with this seemingly, like, they have the majority of seats in the House of Representatives? So in any other scenario, and earlier this year, they then will use their votes, their majority votes, to vote in a Speaker of the House. Why do you think they're having such a hard time with doing that? And you were touching on it, but I think we just go straight into it.
Yeah, no, look, the definition is dysfunction. So I guess how do you get to this dysfunction? I want to be very clear. It's interesting also, like I definitely, just for the audience, I'm not a Democrat, so I'm not here to be a partisan, like beating up Republicans in this discussion. I found one thing, and even preparing today, is when one side is dysfunctional, it actually highlights something of the other side. And I realized, the Democrats, we heard a lot of negative things from kind of the media on the right about Nancy Pelosi during her tenure and all that. And again, I recognize her politics may have upset some people, but I kind of realized watching this, I'm thinking, yeah, it's interesting how she didn't seem to have these problems. She was able to have control of her caucus. So that's part of leadership, is just being able to hold down the fort.
Keeping everybody on board. Yeah.
Correct. And the problem here is, again, whether one agrees with Democratic policies and ideas or not, what I'm going to say is, Democrats still have their own reason of being other than just grievance and anger. No matter what the media tries to tell us, right? It's things like green energy, trying to fight climate change,
social justice, again, things that people may disagree with, but you can name them. And it's
correct. Like we were just saying earlier, like they still believe in redistribution of certain wealth from the tax policies and all that to help those at the bottom and all. That's, to me, I can say, okay, I can point to that. We don't no longer know what the Republican Party is really about in terms of what it used to be. Like you said, the 80s and 90s, early 2000s, because right now they've been cannibalizing their own leaders, because it's almost like this resentment from the ground up. So the base is angry now, constantly angry and triggered. The media triggers them, the social media, all that, the ecosystems trigger. And what we've
a certain part of the base, we should say, because it's not the entire base, but a large enough part of the base that it really, really matters.
Correct. And a very aggressive, like you said, vocal. So it kind of scares the people that aren't as aggressive from standing up against it. And I think that's what we're seeing now with this fight for the new speaker. And so that's the thing. I think that's the issue is it's like the dog that caught the car for a group of people that perform better when they're out of power, if that makes sense. Because when you're out of power, it's easy to constantly criticize and throw tomatoes from the cheap seats and say that everything sucks. But once they get in power, then they don't seem to have that direction, right? Like think about how serious the world just got in the last 2 weeks between the attack from Hamas on Israel. We've got a government shutdown looming in 3 weeks. We still have a land war in Europe, like a real war for the first time since World War II. And the Republican Party can't find a Speaker of the House in this moment of seriousness. So,
which is seemingly a pretty basic function, like that's kind of one of the first steps of leadership is okay, or in Congress. Now, I want to say kind of what you were saying, but in a different light. Like what I see here is that the unifying principle of I'm talking about the coalitions and so forth. The unifying principle seems to be about either the grievance or owning the Dems. It seems to be a unifying principle about the Republicans, settling scores with the media or with Democrats or whatever. It's always about an opponent, a political adversary and so forth. The things that unify them, that animate them, always are about scoring things in a political sense. And so that does leave you ill-equipped when it's just within your own group and saying, okay, all right, within our group, what are we going to do? Because it's like, well, it's not about who they select as a speaker. Whether they can agree on a speaker doesn't have anything to do with really the Democratic Party. It doesn't really have anything to do with the media, and with certain exceptions, which we may get into. But so this is only about looking at the Republicans looking at each other and saying, okay, what do we want to be about? And this is honestly what you brought this up offline. I think you're going to get into this, and so I'm not going to go too far into it. But we saw this start to come to fruition a little bit back in 2020 when the Republican Party, and we've mentioned this on the show before, their platform for the 2020 election was what Donald Trump wants to do. Like it wasn't normally parties, each presidential election, they have a long platform and it's about, we want to build roads and we want to do this and do that. And they didn't do a platform like that for this was just like, we're about what Donald Trump is about. And so that is, again, not to say that is the cause of this, but that's a symptom. That's an example from their own mouths that there aren't a set of principles, a set of things that we want to get done when in power in the country that unite the whole caucus, that bring this coalition of groups together that they all can agree on. And so when you have to say, okay, well, we need leadership, you're ill-equipped really, because all you're about is either we're following this guy who's not here right now, who's not able to become or not going to become the Speaker of the House, or it's about let's make sure that we stop the Dems from doing fill in the blank. And it's like, well, but this is about you having to do something, not dealing with the Democrats, just you yourself. And so can you get everybody on the same page about doing something for yourself as opposed to doing something to thwart what you build your identity around, and thwarting the enemies or thwarting the media or something like that?
Yeah, I think before even getting into the party platforms and that stuff, it's just interesting because again, as you're speaking, I just want to remind the audience, why is this important? Is the Speaker of the House, number one, is basically the next in line for the presidency of the United States after the vice president. So if God forbid, Biden and Harris are traveling somewhere and the plane goes down, the Speaker of the House leads the country. So
well, not just that, the Speaker of the House brings, like, that's a more remote, but they bring legislation to the floor.
That's where I was going next. So right now, with all what I just said going on around the world, and Biden today is in Israel. So again, God forbid something happens, right, in terms of our leadership as a country, then we have no one in position to take that authority. And like you said, we have all this stuff going on, which we just mentioned, and a government that is at risk of shutting down in 3 weeks, and we can't pass any legislation.
We can't even bring it to the floor. Like we can't even consider legislation, so to me, that's like the House of Representatives, their job is to bring legislation to the floor and then pass it, and then the Senate will consider it, or vice versa. The Senate will pass something and the House considers it. We can't do that. Like, Congress cannot operate right now at all.
Yeah, no, that's why I want to say it for the audience, because that's what I mean. This all sounds wonky sometimes and all that, but it's really to stress the point right now. An important branch of our government, out of the three branches, one of them is dysfunctional. Period. And
it's not operational. I would go even further. It's like we got a tricycle and one of the wheels is gone.
Yeah. So no, and that's what I mean. In a time with all this going on, which I mean, look, there's always important things going on, but it seems a little bit heavier now. So going back to the point you said about like the party platform and all that, I mean, I just, preparing for today, I was just thinking about the assault on the American voter by certain parts of our political spectrum. And I got to thinking back, into like, there's three phases of this that have already happened. And now we are entering the new phase, which is, I just stay with me here. 1968 to 1994, I kind of went from Southern strategy through the 94 Congress was kind of phase one. Then I said phase two was kind of the 9/11 and the George W. Bush era, because that was kind of when the nativism, and again, not to bash American people, we were scared after 9/11. And that's when I remember, I've said this in other discussion, the first time I've seen people on the news saying, you're either with us or against us. And the Bush administration was the first time in my life that I saw kind of an authoritarian style presidency in the United States. Remember, we had the issue with the U.S. attorney's offices and the way that the kind of rhetoric from the administration of this, like I said, this with us or against us thing. And a lot of Americans kind of fell into that. And then the next phase I had was the Tea Party era, the 2010s, and the response to Obama's presence. And that led us to kind of now, because I thought about important issues like, let's say, healthcare in this country, which is very important. We had Americans being told there were death panels and all that stuff. And that was now 13 years ago. But the opposing party has not come with any ideas in 13 years of how to make our healthcare system better. At least the party that opposed that. And that's what I'm talking about is, I'm not here to say that the Democratic ideas are the best. We need good, challenging ideas. We just haven't had any, because the party has devolved from a platform of ideas that are conservative and how to, make America better, to now becoming a personality cult of anger, and also this issue of the fealty to one man, like idolatry. Yeah. So,
well, no, I mean, that's an interesting point. In the sense that, like, the reason, if you go back to the 1980s, and you can consider whether this is totally genuine or just convenient, but there was rationale and reasoning provided for why entitlement programs were bad. And it was, like, well, people need to stand on their own 2 feet. If the government helps people, then they become more irresponsible. Like, and that stuff, there is a logical basis for that type of rationale. Like, hey, if it's a welfare, a nanny state, then many people will not try to even stand on their own 2 feet. They'll just, become, part of, just take care of by the government, and that's it. And so versus going to, like, okay, the government's going to foot more of the bill in healthcare. The government's going to do certain parts of healthcare. And the push against that, there may have been some underlying basis from a logical or rational standpoint. But like you said, it became like death panels. It became like deception, trying to get people angry, trying to get people afraid of it, as opposed to being if we need to solve the healthcare problem, which everybody seemed to acknowledge there was, either in terms of costs or in terms of how we're administrating it, we have a different idea. Our idea is better because it won't fall into blank trap and so forth. So there's definitely something there. I mean, one thing I'll point out here is that from the ground up, like, this issue, as you pointed out before, this doesn't seem to be something that's being driven. This level of dysfunction, dissatisfaction, anger doesn't seem to be coming from the top. It seems to be brewing up. And so in the House of Representatives, honestly, it is the branch of our government, or the part of our government in the federal government, that's closest to the people. So if there is a level of dissatisfaction, dysfunction, distrust that's brewing up from the people, it's going to hit the House of Representatives first, most likely, because that's the one. There's 435 of them. Your House districts. Senate is 2 per state. whereas House districts are much smaller, generally speaking, unless it's a very small from a population standpoint state. But the House of Representatives members are supposed to be closest to the citizens, so to speak. So if we're looking with a ground up, kind of movement here, do you think that it actually is revealing, though, more of an issue with the failure in the system? Or do you think this is truly people driven? Like, it's a chicken and egg thing. Like, we can see that there's a lot of anger and resentment in the public, but are there systemic things that you think that are actually driving that as well? Or do you think this is, like a whether it be misguided or not, something that is being driven from the ground up, from the parts of the Republican electorate?
Of course, it's all swirling together to all the ingredients of the stew, but I think that it's a little bit more of the latter than the former. I do think of course, we're a big society with 330 million people, and
then we're only talking about Republican voters right now, because this is
where I'm getting at is, of course, there's systemic issues in any nation as big as ours. That's what I'm saying. Like, I think we need to accept the fact that there's never going to be a finish line when we just get everything done. It's just all this accomplishment stuff, and then everything's great forever for the rest of it.
And also, there's no perfect system.
Because there's 300 plus million of us, so we all have a different idea of maybe how a perfect system might look. And so that's the idea of a democracy, right? Is that we figure it out, we go vote, we vote for people to sit in the House of Representatives to represent us, and they're supposed to vote on our behalf, in the way that we, based on their party, how, like we said at the beginning of this discussion, based on a certain philosophical outlook that a voter has and chooses a party to follow based on that outlook. And so I think that I don't want to get to beating up the system so much, because the system's never been perfect. Like I remind people, we used to have slavery in this country where human beings were owned like cattle. Then we had segregation. We had women's suffrage for a reason, because there was a time up until 100 years ago, women couldn't vote. So there's all that stuff, right? That's just reality. And so right now, if I compare it to all those prior things that we could talk about, the system is okay, for the general American in general. Now, I understand the middle class is smaller than it was and all that, but those are the normal debates that you're supposed to have in politics, right? And we've gone from that to freaking out about, whether a transvestite holds a beer can, or if the, stoves are going to be gas or electric. And that's what I mean, like, things that in the wake of this recent stuff going on, like the war between Hamas and Israel, and you think about Ukraine still going on, and literally they're still sending missiles at each other in Europe, and just all this serious stuff, all of a sudden all that stuff looks so petty. And it's interesting, because with this anger, I do think it's coming from the ground up. And I think what we've done is, because leadership's important, and we've just watched over the last decade Republican leaders that saw this coming try to get ahead of it and tell the public that this is what's going to happen, and they've all been pushed out of the party.
Yeah.
So I don't know where we go from here, right?
No,
from
that's
John McCain to Liz Cheney, in the recent example is
Jeff Flake. Yeah, there's a bunch of them, and now Mitt Romney's the one. That's but there's been a steady line of Republican leaders who have been out, as they've been pushed out or walked out, been like, "Yo, this is not going where you guys think it's going."
But it's the sad part. I just want to say this before you take over, because I want to get your thoughts on this. This has led us to the point where, because there's a lack of real leadership, I was just thinking about the death panels from that we remember from the Obamacare stuff, all that fear,
which was a purposeful deception. We didn't say that, it was a purposeful deception to make people afraid, make people mad, in order to then manipulate them.
But that was back when you could still, one could make an argument that was a deception, because the philosophy of the overall party, of the Republican Party, was to fear something like universal style healthcare and all this. So by gumming up the works in the public perception, they were able to get the closest thing to non-universal, which was the idea that private health insurance would just get subsidized by the government. But fast forward, the reason I'm bringing this up is fast forward to right now, like the last few weeks, I've seen immediately, when asked why McCarthy lost his speakership, on his own press conference after he lost, one of the things he did was blame Nancy Pelosi. He said that because she promised him she would step up and support him, and she didn't. And then the day that Hamas attacked Israel, all the Republican candidates for president blamed Joe Biden. And a few days later, the leading frontrunner of the Republican Party for president said Hezbollah was very smart, and praised President Xi because he can keep 1.4 billion people in line.
Well,
and none of the people had a comment on that. So what I'm saying is the lack of leadership got us here.
Well, the deception, though, you can say, oh, well, the previous deception was more honorable because it led to, but that opened the door for just deception. It was just like, look,
but that's
and this is Mitt Romney's point. Well,
yeah.
This is Mitt Romney's point that he's been saying for a few years is that we got to stop. Speaking of him and his fellow Republicans, we got to stop lying to our people. That's not me saying that. That's what Mitt Romney is saying. And so you open the door, and this is what comes through basically is like, okay, well, let's deceive to try to defeat a legislative priority of the Democrats. And now it's like, well, let's deceive for other reasons too. The deceptions seem to work. And so, I mean, to me, I think there are systemic issues, in terms of how the system is driven by money and some of these things that have been unraveled actually in the last 20 years in terms of, money in politics and just the nature of what it takes to get in power and to stay in power. I think lead people to a place that may lead to more dysfunction. But what we're seeing here is driven from the ground up. I don't think there's no equivocation about that. And the way this is that people who are pushing for stability and or for rationality are punished at the polls, and people that are pushing for chaos and for, just let's blow it up are rewarded at the polls. And you talk about how, the political candidates, when this Hamas does this crazy attack on Israel. And, again, when we've talked about that, like that, I'm one that can look at what Hamas did and call that crazy while still understanding that there's complexities going on in the entire, Israel-Palestinian type of front, or that what's happening there. But, like, again, you can distinguish that. So I'm not going to go down that point, but look at that and then say, hey, what should we do? Oh, let's blame Joe Biden. The reason for that is what we talked about earlier, because they know there are very few things that unite all Republicans these days. But one of those things are blaming something on the Democrats. Like, that's one of the things that pulls the whole coalition together. So that's kind of one of their only. Yeah, that's one of their only plays. If they could blame the Democrats successfully for something with the speaker vote, they could, I'm sure, solve that right away, too. Because that will get everybody online. Once it becomes something they can blame, they can find some way, whether it's honest or dishonest, to blame the Democrats for. So to me, the fact that the agents of chaos are the ones that are ascendant, that you don't come in, cause chaos, and then it's like you're worried that, oh man, I don't know if I cause chaos, I don't think the voters will appreciate that. That to me makes it clear that this is something that's driven from the ground up. But so the real question, honestly, is why? Why are particularly because this is the part that I find so fascinating, is that why are Republican voters, much more so than other voters, Democratic voters or more independent voters, so disturbed perpetually right now that they support people who essentially are out there saying we got to blow it up, debate and compromise. We can't debate. We can't compromise. Forget the separation of powers. Everything needs to be streamlined. Democratic elections are optional if we don't win. What is driving the ground up swell that's in the Republican Party? It's not the whole, group, but what's driving that? Because to me, and I can you can, take a look at this or take a, shot at this if you want, or not. But to me, that actually is the question that is really raised here when you're looking at, okay, there are a lot of people here that seem like they're just out on a lot of the things that we talk about in terms of, okay, well, yeah, there needs to be debate, there needs to be compromise, there needs to be, we're Americans, we're all Americans, and we need to be pulling in the same direction. And that doesn't seem to be something we can agree on right now.
Yeah. Look, there's a lot there. I think because I'll finish off on your last question, but I want to go back. As you were talking, I wrote a note here that you're right about this anger is coming from the ground up, And in my opinion, it's like we talked about the death panels, right? It's being manipulated by specifically media outlets. And I want to say this, this idea that the liberal media is the most powerful thing in the world is, again, interesting, because I would say the mainstream media is more corporate than liberal. We can get into that, but you think about it, everyone recognizes that the top cable news opinion heads and anchors in the evening slots are all on Fox.
Yeah.
It's former Tucker Carlson, it's Sean Hannity, it's Laura Ingraham. They're the ones that
it's
dominate.
Seemingly whoever they put on TV.
Yeah,
because you can go back to Bill O'Reilly and whoever they put on TV instantly becomes the most powerful news anchor.
Yep, and we learned a lot through,
or not anchor, but opinion,
like the discovery process during the Dominion lawsuit, that there's a lot of money to be made with this anger style of selling media, and that's one reason why Fox lost its lawsuit and had to settle, because it was evident that once they actually got honest about the election not being stolen, they were losing viewership to other outlets, and they got worried about their stock price and other things, and they started lying. And so that's where it's sad, because we saw in writing text messages from anchors like Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity that they didn't believe what they were telling their own viewers. And that's why it's a very difficult thing for me to wrap my mind around, because I don't necessarily blame the voters, because they're being told by people that they're supposed to trust, like TV anchors and like congressmen and senators who they elect and who are in their ecosystem of messaging. And so
hence Mitt Romney's point. Hence that was Mitt Romney's point.
When you have people that are elected officials telling you things that are lies, I'm not going to blame the people there. That's why I said it's really about leadership. And so the problem is that what I wrote here was that McCarthy was voted out because he compromised.
Yep.
Because he dared to keep the government open. And what they don't realize is, like the debt ceiling debate just a few months ago, McCarthy actually got so many concessions out of Joe Biden and the Democrats for the debt ceiling. Remember, a month before the debt ceiling deadline, Biden was like, I'm not debating anything. You guys come to the table with it, just keep going to clean and or else I'm not doing it. By the end of that debate, to keep the government or the debt ceiling going up, Republicans were able to get the IRS funding put to this side. They were able to get a lot of things done. And so the fact that McCarthy was fired by his own party for compromising on keeping the government open, which would keep 2 million Americans employed by the government with a paycheck and keep our ability to function properly, shows you a lot. It shows you that we now have a group of politicians that really are just interested in their own power and not just
that, they see that they derive power from chaos. So they're interested in their they're interested in their power, and they understand, and they seem to have a really good feel for the fact that they derive power from creating chaos. And it's interesting. You brought up the whole liberal media boogeyman, corporate media type of thing. But if we look at the last couple of years, whether it be the Dominion lawsuit, whether it be what's happening right now with the speakership and so forth, the way that we see the Fox Newses of the world and the radio hosts or podcast hosts, it seems like conservative media is the most powerful force right now, because they're able to topple like the leadership of the House, or they're able to put up a presidential candidate and keep his support strong through indictment after indictment. And so, it's quite a, it almost becomes, the indictment of the liberal media is almost like the ultimate throw off, the liberal media, which again, you and I call the corporate media, because, these aren't nonprofits that are out here,
it's the need to have a boogeyman, I mean, it's just, and it's also,
it's the need to have, remember, because if your coalition is united by sticking it to people, you got to have people to stick it to. And so you either have to have the boogeyman or create the boogeyman so that you can unite people behind sticking it to that person, or in other words, a straw man, like you create it like that. So I mean, I do want to move to the next topic. I mean, there's still a lot happening, like I said, with this, and this is going to be an ongoing story. But even if Jim Jordan, who is up for the position now, if he's able to win the election and become the Speaker of the House, we're not seeing the last of this, basically. Jim Jordan is more closely aligned with the far right, members of the House, and you will see how he governs. But he understands where his bread is buttered as well. So, again, if it's not very democratic for 8 House of Representative members out of 435 to be able to hold so many cards, but it's the situation we're in because, as I pointed out in the beginning, who's in charge amongst the 220 so members of Republican House of Representative members? That's what's being fought over right now. And so we're going to see how that plays out over the next year or so, over the next week, and next day, and then over the next year. So the second topic we want to discuss today, you had sent me a piece that was very interesting the other day, and it was just about how Latinos in the U.S., their economic output measured in terms of GDP, now exceeds the GDP of India, the country. And India has 1.4 billion people in it, and that's not some completely third world. India that's a nuclear power. They sent something to space not so long ago. Like, it's a serious country. And so, I mean, what are your thoughts on this, as far as just a segment of our population, not a majority segment or anything, but just a segment of our population having such robust economic output relative to just other world powers?
Well, without intensely trying to tie in the part 1 of our show today and our conversation with now, is that might have to do with some of this anger in the public. We have a demographic that just is doing so well compared to everyone else. I could see that being, an issue for people, especially given the history of our country. So they're not for everybody, but for enough people that they get vocal about it. I find this very interesting. Look, first thing, I'm happy to see this, right? I mean, at the end of the day, we're American, so any group in this country who's having a nice big economic boom is helping the rest of us. So we're all sharing this economy together. So I will say,
well, that's if you look at it like that. Again, to your point you just made,
like I said,
if you look
I'm
at it like, hey, Americans
Some
are in this
people,
together, then
yeah. I'm not angry about it. Maybe someone else is, but not me.
Well, no, I mean, that's the thing. Great. If you take the mindset that Americans are in it together, then you would take this as positive news. But if you're looking at it, Americans are fighting over a zero-sum type of thing, then you might not see this as a good thing.
Yeah. Well,
if you're not, if you're not inclined,
and I'm also happy to add. I'll add a few more countries. So not only is U.S. Latino GDP output higher than India, but it's also higher than the UK, France, Italy, and Canada. So again, like you said, these are serious countries with their own big economies and all that. And so the other thing that I found interesting with the stat, there we go. So I'll just quote this article, from 2011 to 2021, so over a 10-year period, the U.S. Latino economy was the 3rd fastest growing among major economies, trailing only China and India. Mm-hmm. So it grew at a pace faster than any other country outside those 2 countries. And it grew at a pace faster than the United States as a whole. Yeah. So it's fascinating. I think it's, I would have the attitude of, why wouldn't I be happy, or anyone be happy? But I recognize, like you said, some people look at it as if they're doing better, then I must not be. So,
I mean, and there are a certain number of people in the world that do bring that zero-sum mentality, but again, if you're trying to have a pluralistic society, that could be dangerous.
Well, see, I'm going to say this to be really nerdy about it. This is the beauty that we got off the gold standard in 1973 and now have fractional and banking and inflationary deficits, because the pie just keeps growing.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That definitely is one of the benefits, is the pie. If you do it right, the pie can continue to grow. Exactly. And I mean, and my take on this
until it collapses, but until then we're good.
Well, but that's why I say if you do it right, because if you don't do it right, then you're walking yourself to a collapse. Yeah. But and we've learned those lessons already, but again, we've talked about before, kind of the living memory. Just because we've learned the lesson doesn't mean we're going to apply those apply what we learned over generation over generation.
Funded in 3 weeks.
Yeah. So, but to me, what stands out about this one is just how big the United States is. Like we talk about all these other countries and like they the United States is just a very large country from a landmass standpoint and a population standpoint. Now, it's not as large as India or China or something like that in terms of population, but when you look at like European powers and so forth, like the size of some of our states will exceed them. You know, California, we know, is one of the largest economies, you know, on its own, in largest economies in the world. And so just the sheer size of the United States and the size of the United States economy is staggering when you can take a 15-20% slice and say, okay, this now exceeds so much, so many other places in the world. The other thing is, I think this is also indicative of that our economic system, again, while, you know, I can raise some issues with it in terms of how well it's able to reward the winners on an ongoing basis and not just those who won previously, but it's a really, really good system. I mean, that you can have a group within a society have such a big leap. Now, the group may have had more room to grow because of where they were starting, you know, coming in, you know, if it's a lot of with a lot of immigrants and so forth, there's a lot of room to grow there, because immigrants typically don't come well in mass with a lot of things to their name already. But, you know, it really does show, you know, that the system that we do have is one that is good for promoting economic activity, you know, which is not a given around the world. And so, you know, you look at things like the infrastructure, the courts, the banks, the regulation that some people hate. But again, this is the stuff that sets the stage for growth like this and for economic activity. So we can sometimes, a lot of times, we get hung up on the imperfections or the things that it's like, oh, okay, well, we got all these mass accumulations of wealth, and, you know, that's undermining our political system, that's underlining our market system and all that. We plenty to complain about, but sometimes it's good to just take the larger view and say, wow, this is quite an operation that we have going here. And that's what really stands out to me about that. And kudos to, you know, like, it's not like we a lot of times we look at the Latin American community or, you know, the Latino community and be like, it's one group and they're all in one place. And it's like, well, no, this is dispersed throughout the United States. But still, it does show that any of these groups that, you know, we segment ourselves out as, we're all Americans, one, but two, we want more opportunities, because then this can happen. You know, like, you create more opportunities, then more groups can grow. And as you pointed out, and which I agree, this makes the United States overall stronger.
Yeah. And I think also it highlights I mean, again, not to beat a dead horse about part one, but the dysfunction of our Congress really hurts a topic like this in the future about our ability to bring in immigrants in an organized way that will then, like you're saying, work and help grow the economy. Because if we don't, we're going to be like Europe and Japan, where we have a falling birth rate.
The aging society issue. Yeah,
correct.
Like, that's, America's been able to avoid the aging society issue, United States, for so long because of immigrants, you know, and so can keep a society, keep a culture or society that keeps growing, and an economy that keeps growing and growing and growing, because we keep getting an influx of, and I always point this out, the immigrant is not the one who's lazy. The immigrant is the one who got up and moved hundreds or thousands of miles, you know, and the people that stayed behind are the people that are the less motivated, not all the time, but a lot of times, you know. So that's like, how about we tell another country, hey, how about you send us, you know, the people that, you know, the real go-getters of your society, and you keep everybody else. Like, normally, you know, you would think from a logical standpoint, somebody like, yeah, that's a good deal for the United States. So no, you're 100% right.
Well, I think it's a victim of just, again, the dysfunction we talked about in the first half of the show. And again, a lot of Americans now have been trained to be very angry about
everything,
immigration and the southern border,
everything.
And so, everything, but that especially. And so when I look at, you know, I'm looking at another thing I'll read. Latinos significantly bolstered the U.S. economy through population growth, a high degree of workforce participation, and increased productivity linked to educational attainment.
Yeah.
So what I realized in reading, I was like, okay, if they're Latino, then 100% of them were immigrants from south of this country into this country. Now,
well, not immediately. It could be generational, but nonetheless,
of course. But what I'm saying is, at some point, someone was not in the United States and came here, or else they'd be a Native American, not Native American indigenous, but an American that from, you know, Europe, right, or from the Mayflower or some English ship. So everyone else would be considered an immigrant in a different way than either someone that settled the colonies, or an African slave descendant, or a Native American as an indigenous. Everyone else is an immigrant or descendants of immigrants. So the reality is that by me saying that doesn't mean that I don't recognize we have an issue with the border right now, and it needs to be streamlined. But who's the only one that can fix that without doing something authoritarian, like just saying, build a wall or send the military, is Congress, right? We need new immigration laws, because this is evidence, again, it's one of those things, numbers don't lie. Like you said, the people coming here are the people who have enough either stress in their own country or ambition that they're going to come here and work. We just need to make it an organized system again, like it was in the past prior to, let's say, the last 20 years of our own dysfunction. So again, that's
and
one thing.
The point being is that when the system is disorganized, then what you have is a disorganized rush to the border. When the system is organized and predictable, then people can participate in an organized and predictable system. And the idea of just rushing the border is less, it's less appealing, because, then you're going to get caught, or, yada, yada, yada. But when that's the only option, because the system is broken and there is no legitimate means to say, okay, I'm going to apply, I got to wait 3 years, and then they'll bring me in, then, you incentivize the chaos at the border by not creating an alternate solution. And that's really what we're lacking a lot of times when in this immigration debate. It's always framed as, we just got to stop what's happening at the border. And it's like, well, why is that happening at the border? It's happening at the border because the signals that we're sending is that there is no organized way to do this. There is no proper way that we've set up that we can do this and that it works. If you want to get in here, you got to just rush the border. That's the signal we're sending by not having a set system. And like you said, that has to originate from Congress.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say. That's the problem of having Congress being dysfunctional on a topic like this, and then having it only any changes made through executive orders by a president. Because you make a good point. Every time, and since George W. Bush, who tried this and wasn't able to get the Congress around to doing anything. So we've had now Bush, Obama, Trump, and now Biden, 4 presidents that, you're right, each one sends a different signal. And so each time we have a new president, it's a different signal to South American countries. And of course, they're dealing with their own misinformation. And
each time we have an election, they know there's about to be a different signal. And like, so it creates the madness. That's what I mean. It creates,
So we don't have permanent legislation where no matter who the president is, the understanding is this is how you deal with coming in the US. And also for us Americans to know.
Yeah.
And, I guess maybe somebody benefits from Americans being angry and this system being chaotic. I'm not
That's
sure.
Going back to the first part. Yes, there are people who seem to benefit from and understand they benefit from chaos and anger and fear. And so, I mean, honestly, the biggest thing is that people who don't want chaos, anger, and fear, or don't want to emphasize or prioritize those, have to take a look at their own choices and have to look at who they're supporting and so forth to make sure that they're not plugging into or supporting, and in fact, hopefully opposing the agents of chaos and the people who derive power from chaos. And again, not just dumb luck deriving power from chaos, but understand they derive power from chaos, and so they'll therefore set out to create chaos that they will then derive power from. So, but I think we can wrap from there. We appreciate everybody for joining us on this episode.
Let me ask you, make sure I understand. You're asking me as a citizen that I should pay attention?
We do appreciate everybody for joining us on this episode of Call Like I See It. Subscribe to the podcast, rate it, review us, tell us what you think, send it to a friend. Until next time, I'm James Keys. All right, we'll talk to you next time.